The morning I decided to quit, I was sitting in a parking lot outside the base, staring at a set of papers I had been avoiding for 11 days. Transfer orders, not the kind you request. The kind that get handed to you across a desk by someone who can't quite look you in the eye when they do it. The kind that come with a handshake that feels more like a verdict than a farewell, more like a door being closed behind you than one being opened in front of you. I had been a soldier for 6 years. I had trained harder than most people I knew, harder than most of the men I had served alongside, harder than anyone in my family had expected or understood. I had volunteered for every difficult assignment, every early morning formation, every weekend training exercise that nobody else wanted to show up for. I had done everything right, or at least everything I knew how to do, and somehow I had ended up here, in a parking lot, in the dark, with a set of papers on the seat beside me that said I was no longer fit to serve in my unit. My name is Naomi Carter. At the time of this story, I was 24 years old, a sergeant in the United States Army stationed at a base in Kentucky. Today I am 34, a captain, and I teach resilience training to soldiers who are exactly where I was that morning. But the distance between those two versions of me was not built on motivation or inspiration or any of the things people like to talk about in speeches and social media posts and the kind of self-help books that sound wise until you're actually drowning and realize that no combination of words has ever stopped water from rising. It was built on 4 months with a man I almost drove past on a 2-lane road, a man I almost didn't stop for, and everything he taught me started with a single sentence that I didn't fully understand until much later. Pain isn't the enemy, he said. The running is. If this story is already hitting somewhere you recognize, if something in those words landed before I've even told you the rest, do me a favor right now. Hit subscribe, hit the like button, because what comes next is the part that changed everything for me, and I want to make sure you don't miss it. This channel exists because people like you believe these stories deserve to be heard. So if you're still with me, let's keep going. I need to take you back before that moment. Back to the beginning of the worst year of my life, because you cannot understand what that sentence meant to me, what it cracked open inside me, without first understanding what I had been carrying when I heard it. My father's name was Gerald Carter. He was a postal worker, a church deacon, a man who wore the same style of brown work boots every single day for 30 years and never complained about anything. Not the weather, not his back, not the hours, not the solitude of raising a daughter on his own in a neighborhood where resources were thin and expectations were sometimes thinner. He used to say that complaining was borrowing trouble from tomorrow, and that tomorrow had enough of its own without you going out of your way to invite more. He believed in showing up. He believed in finishing what you started. He believed, above everything else, that the people you love deserve your best effort. Not your best excuses, not your best intentions, but your actual best effort on the actual day that the effort is required. He raised me alone after my mother left when I was 7 years old. He did it without ever making me feel like a burden, without ever sitting across from me at the dinner table and letting me see the exhaustion in his eyes, without ever once suggesting that the life he had ended up with was not the life he had chosen. He just worked. He just showed up, day after day, year after year, in those brown boots on that same route through a neighborhood in Kentucky, carrying other people's mail, coming home to cook dinner, checking my homework, making sure I knew that even when the world felt like it was contracting, our specific corner of it was held together by someone who intended to keep holding it. He was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer on a Tuesday in October, a regular checkup, a result that arrived by phone. I remember where I was when he told me, standing in the corridor outside a supply room on the base, holding my phone with both hands like it might do something different than what it had already done. 5 months. That was the window the doctors gave him, and that was approximately what they meant. He was gone by the following March. I had taken emergency leave twice during that period, and each time I came back to base, I told myself I was handling it. I told my commanding officer I was handling it. I told the unit psychologist during a routine evaluation that I was processing things in a healthy way. I told everyone who asked that I was a soldier and that soldiers understood better than most. That loss was part of the contract you signed when you put on the uniform. I was not handling it. I was not processing things in a healthy way. I was not fine. What I was doing, and I understand this now in a way I was completely incapable of understanding then, was performing okayness with such commitment and consistency that I had convinced myself it was the same as actually being okay. I had taken every feeling connected to my father's illness and his decline, and the specific terror of watching someone strong become fragile. I had taken all of it and I had placed it in the deepest sealed room I had access to, and I had locked the door and turned my back to it and kept moving. I had kept working, I had kept training, I had kept my face even and my voice steady and my reports filed on time. I started missing details about 3 months after the diagnosis. Small things at first, a form filed a day late, a report with a computational error I would never have made when my mind was fully present, then larger things. A training exercise where I froze at a decision point that should have been automatic. A choice that every part of my training had prepared me to make instantly, that I had made correctly dozens of times before, that in this moment simply would not come. A qualification test I failed by 2 points, a score I had never come close to missing in my previous attempts. My reaction time slowed in ways that showed up in metrics. My focus scattered in ways that showed up in evaluations. And the worst and most disorienting part of all of it was that I could feel it happening. I was watching it happen from some remove, watching my own performance deteriorate, watching the machine I had spent 6 years building come loose at the joints, and I could not find the lever that would stop it. My father died on a Saturday morning in March. I was there. I was holding his hand when his breathing changed, and I was holding his hand when it stopped. I stayed through the afternoon. I helped with the arrangements that needed to be made immediately. I called the people who needed to be called. And then I flew back to base 2 days later because I genuinely, completely believed that returning to work would fix something inside me. That the structure and the routine and the weight of responsibilities and the presence of people who needed me to be functional would fill the space where my father had been. It didn't fill anything. It couldn't. I understand why I thought it would, because I had spent months already using work as the mechanism by which I avoided sitting with what was happening. And it had worked. In the way that running from something works, it had kept me moving, kept me from stopping, kept me from having to stand still long enough for the thing chasing me to catch up. But running is not a permanent solution. Your legs are finite, your speed is finite. And grief, I was learning, is patient in a way that human beings are not constitutionally capable of matching. Mine caught up with me in April, 8 weeks after my father died. During a routine field exercise that I had completed successfully on more occasions than I could count, something happened that I still find difficult to describe with precision. I did not have a panic attack in the clinical sense. I did not collapse. What happened was quieter than that, and in its own way, more complete. I simply stopped. In the middle of the field, with my unit around me and my commanding officer watching, the part of me that had been running finally refused to take another step. It was not a choice. It was not a decision. It was a system reaching its absolute limit and shutting down with a finality that left no room for argument. I was removed from the exercise. I was sent to the base medical facility. I was evaluated, counseled, observed across several sessions, and monitored for the weeks that followed. And then, 11 days after that afternoon in the field, my commanding officer sat across from me and slid a set of papers across the desk and told me, with genuine kindness in his voice, that this was a step back taken so that I could take a step forward, that the Army needed soldiers who were whole, that my record showed someone of significant capability, and that this situation did not define what my career could be. He was right about all of that. I believe he meant every word of it. But sitting in that parking lot that evening, with the base behind me and the papers on the seat beside me and the last light of the day fading over the tree line to the west, all I felt was that I had failed. I had failed my unit. I had failed the standards I had set for myself from the first day I put on the uniform. I had failed my father, who had spent 30 years modeling what it looks like to carry hard things with grace, and whose daughter had apparently not absorbed that lesson well enough to apply it when it mattered. I sat in that parking lot for a long time, long enough for the spaces around me to empty out one vehicle at a time until I was one of 3 cars left in the entire lot. I was not making a plan. I was not processing. I was simply sitting in the specific heaviness of a person who has run as far as running goes and found nothing on the other side of it except more running. I started the car eventually. I told myself I would drive to the small apartment I was renting in a quiet area near the base, where I had been living for the past 2 years, a place that had gradually stopped feeling like home and had started feeling like a place where I slept between shifts of performing okayness. I would drive there. I would pack a bag. I would figure out what came next. I never made it home that evening. About 3 miles from the base, on a two-lane road that cuts through a wide stretch of open land between the installation and the nearest town, I saw a truck pulled over on the shoulder. Not a young man's truck, an older model, well-maintained, a dark green that had held up well over the years. And standing behind it, looking at a flat rear tire with an expression of complete, unhurried calm that seemed almost impossible given the circumstances, was an older man. He appeared to be in his early 60s, average height, gray hair cut close. He was wearing a plain dark jacket and work pants, and he was holding a lug wrench in one hand while studying the wheel with the focused, deliberate attention of someone thinking through a problem rather than reacting to one. Not frustrated, not making calls, just thinking it through. I almost didn't stop. I want to be honest about that because the version of this story where I immediately and heroically pull over is not what happened. I slowed down. I looked at him through the window for a moment that lasted long enough to have a small internal argument with myself. I thought about the papers. I thought about the apartment. I thought about the state I was in and whether I had anything left to give to a stranger's flat tire on the side of a road in the fading light. I thought about just driving past and being forgiven for it because of the day I had just had. But my father's voice was louder than my exhaustion, which is something I have found to be true every time I have tested it, without exception. My father used to say that you find out who you are in the moments when nobody is watching and nothing is in it for you. He used to say that character is not what you do at your best, when you are rested and fed and full of motivation and surrounded by people who will notice and remember. Character is what you do when you have given everything you have and someone still needs something from you. I pulled over. I walked back along the shoulder to where he was standing. I asked if he needed help. He looked up at me with calm, dark eyes that had something in them I couldn't identify immediately, a depth, a quality of attention, and said yes, that he had a flat, but that he had made the mistake of removing his lug nut key from the car 2 days before to loan it to a neighbor for a home repair, and had simply forgotten to put it back. Without the key, the lug nuts wouldn't come off, and without the lug nuts, the tire wasn't going anywhere. He had already called for roadside assistance, he said, and had been told the wait was over an hour. I carried a complete kit in my vehicle. Standard practice drilled into me early. The key in my kit was compatible. I told him we could fix it. We worked without a great deal of conversation. He was precise. He was economical in his movements. He didn't need direction, and he didn't need assistance in the way someone unfamiliar with the process would need it. He needed the specific tool that was missing, and once he had it, the rest proceeded with a quiet efficiency that I noticed even then, even in the state I was in. When the tire was changed and the flat was secured in the bed of the truck, he straightened up and looked at me in a way that I would only understand the significance of much later. Not the way a stranger looks at someone who has helped them. Something more deliberate than that. "You look like you're carrying something heavy," he said. I laughed because it was so precisely accurate that my only available response was a laugh. "Long day," I said. "Longer than that," he said. Not as a question. Then he extended his hand and told me his name was Raymond Holt, that his friends called him Ray, and he asked if I wanted to get coffee at a diner that was about 2 miles up the road. I don't know, in retrospect, exactly why I said yes. The simplest explanation is that I was exhausted and empty and had nowhere particular to be and nothing particular to return to. Maybe the more accurate explanation is that something in the quality of that look, something in the steadiness of it, registered on a level below conscious thought as the kind of presence that doesn't come along very often, and that some part of me, the part that had been running for months and was finally too tired to take another step, recognized it. I followed that dark green truck down the 2-lane road in the last of the evening light. What I did not know as I followed it, what I had absolutely no framework for knowing, was who Raymond Holt was. Raymond Holt had spent 30 years in the United States Navy, none of it behind a desk and none of it in a support capacity. 30 years in naval special warfare, the community known to the world as the Navy SEALs, a name that stands for sea, air, and land. The 3 operational domains these men are trained and prepared to operate in. He had entered the basic underwater demolition and SEAL training course, known by its acronym BUD-AT-S, at 22 years old, at a point in the program's history when its attrition rate was among the highest of any military training program in existence. He had graduated. He had deployed. He had conducted operations across the Middle East and South America in missions that remain classified to this day in theaters that appear in no public accounting of those years. He had risen to a senior enlisted rank over the course of a career that involved decisions and actions that most civilians could not fully imagine and most soldiers would never be asked to make. In the final decade of his service, he had transitioned into an instructor role at the Naval Special Warfare Training Command, where his specific function was the psychological evaluation and development of candidates progressing through the selection process. Not the physical training, there were other instructors for that. His specialty was the mind, the specific territory of human cognition and emotional architecture that determines when everything physical has been stripped away and the body is exhausted and the circumstances are severe, whether a person continues or stops. He had spent 10 years learning to identify, with an accuracy that his colleagues found remarkable, the candidates who had something that could not be trained into a person. And he had learned, with equal precision, the specific approaches that could unlock what was already there in the ones who had it. He had been awarded the Silver Star for actions during a classified operation that has never been publicly described. He had received 2 Bronze Stars. He had buried men he had trained and loved. He had carried for 30 years a weight that most people will never be asked to carry, and he had come out on the other side of it with the particular kind of quiet that is not emptiness or numbness, or the shutdown of someone who has seen too much. It is the stillness of a person who has made complete peace with everything they have experienced and found, in that peace, something solid to stand on. He was also, as far as I knew that evening, just an older man who had forgotten his lug nut key and made decent conversation over bad diner coffee. He asked about the papers on my passenger seat before we had finished our first cup. He had seen them through the window when I pulled up behind his truck on the shoulder. I hadn't mentioned them. I considered deflecting. I considered the version of myself who had spent months telling everyone she was fine. Instead, I told him the truth. I told him about my father, about the diagnosis and the 5 months and the specific quality of watching a strong person become fragile. I told him about coming back to base after the funeral and believing that work would fix what nothing could fix. I told him about the field exercise and the papers and the parking lot. I told him all of it in the fluorescent light of a booth in a roadside diner, with a coffee cup that kept being refilled by a server who had the professional good sense not to interrupt. Ray listened to every word without speaking, not the way people listen when they are waiting for a
Very
task to respond.
transparent.
The way people listen who have learned, through long practice, that the most valuable thing you can offer someone who is in pain is your complete and uninterrupted
Highly
attention.
unlikely.
When I finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough
So
to
they
feel
push
uncomfortable.
me.
Then he said, "You've been
What
running
does
from
it
it."
look like a
"From what?"
fractured
I said. "From the pain," he said. "Your father died, and instead of sitting with that, you went back to work. You built activity around the loss the way you'd build a wall around something you didn't want to touch. You called the wall strength. You told people on both sides of it that you were fine." He turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. And then one afternoon in a field, the wall came down anyway, because walls built from avoidance don't hold. They only delay. I wanted to argue. I had the argument ready that returning to work was what soldiers did, that functioning under pressure was what I had been trained for, that staying busy was not the same as running. But something in the evenness of his delivery, the complete absence of judgment in it, no pity, no performance of sympathy, just the flat precision of someone who had seen this specific pattern in human beings more times than he could count, made the argument feel like exactly what it was, which was another form of running. "So, what's the alternative?" I asked. He looked at me for a moment before answering. "That," he said, "is what I'd like to show you, if you're willing to actually look." He wrote his number on a paper napkin. He told me he ran at 5 in the morning on a trail near a park at the edge of town, and that I was welcome to join him, but only if I was serious. The word serious landed with a weight that told me he had used it precisely. I drove home. I sat with the napkin for 2 days. Then I called. He answered on the second ring. "5 tomorrow morning," he said. "Don't be late." I wasn't. The trail was harder than I expected. Uneven terrain through the edge of a state park, with routes that grabbed at your feet in the early dark, inclines that seemed moderate until they didn't. A stretch near the end that was genuinely difficult. I was 24 and in military condition, and he was 62, and I worked to keep pace with him. Not because he was fast. He wasn't. Because he was absolutely, completely, unvaryingly relentless. A pace that felt sustainable until you were 40 minutes into it and realized it had not shifted by a single step in either direction. Afterward, Sitting on a wooden bench at the trailhead while my lungs returned to normal function, I asked him who he was. He smiled. It was not a smile that gave anything away. "A man who used to do this for a living," he said. That was all. And I learned quickly that pushing for more was not the way this worked. He would tell me what he decided to tell me when he decided to tell me. The rest of it would come through the running and the mornings and the conversation that followed. Over the weeks that came after, our mornings established a rhythm that became, without my fully intending it to, the most important part of each day. The trail, the bench, the particular kind of conversation that only happens between people who have already said the difficult things and have nothing left to perform for each other. And gradually, Raymond Holt began to teach me things. Not with a syllabus, not in a sequence he had designed in advance, in the way that the most important knowledge moves through the specific encounter between a particular teacher and a particular student, in a particular moment, when the conditions are exactly right for something to be received that was not receivable before. The first real lesson came about 3 weeks in. He stopped in the middle of the trail, something he had not done before, and turned to face me. "Tell me what you think strength is," he said. I gave him the answer that 6 years of military training had shaped in me. Endurance, discipline, the ability to continue functioning when conditions made functioning difficult. He shook his head. "That's what strength looks like when someone is watching," he said. "That's performance." I asked what it actually is. I didn't have a different answer. He started walking, and I fell in beside him. "I spent 10 years watching men go through the hardest selection process this military has ever designed," he said. "Men who were extraordinary physical specimens, men who had spent years preparing specifically for that program, who could run faster and carry more and sustain effort longer than almost anyone around them." He paused for several steps. "They quit anyway, not because their bodies gave out. Their bodies had significant reserves remaining. They quit because they had a relationship with discomfort that I could only describe as a negotiation." "A negotiation," I repeated. They would accept discomfort up to a certain threshold. And when the experience crossed that threshold, they would find, very quickly, very convincingly, a reason why this particular situation was the exception. Why today was the day when stopping was the reasonable choice. They had established their limits before they ever arrived. And when suffering exceeded those predetermined limits, they were done. He navigated a route without looking down at it. The ones who completed the program had a fundamentally different relationship with discomfort. They didn't set limits for it. They didn't negotiate with it. They moved toward it. We reached a long hill. He didn't reduce his pace. Most people's nervous system, every part of it, responds to discomfort with a single, consistent message. Move away from this. Get comfortable. Stop. Rest. And most people respond to that message because it is loud and it is convincing, and because it genuinely believes it is looking out for you. He was breathing evenly as we climbed, but it is not wisdom. It is the part of you that wants to remain exactly where it is, and where you currently are is not where you are capable of going. He told me about a candidate he had worked with during his years as an instructor, a young man from a small town, not the most physically gifted in his class, not the fastest or the strongest. But this candidate had something that Ray said he learned to recognize within the first week of any selection cycle. Something he described as a willingness, almost without limit, to move toward the thing that was hardest. Cold water immersion, one of the most psychologically demanding elements of that program, broke candidates regularly, not because the cold was medically dangerous under the supervised conditions. It was severe and sustained, and the mind would begin producing increasingly urgent demands for it to end. This particular young man seemed to locate something within those sessions that other candidates were not finding. Not pleasure, that would be completely the wrong word. A kind of clarity, a narrowing of attention that the severity of the discomfort seemed to produce in him, clearing away everything secondary and leaving only what was essential. I pulled him aside after the third session, Ray said. I asked him what was happening in his head during it, and he told me something I carried for the rest of my career. He paused. He said, I decided before I got in the water that the cold wasn't my enemy. So when it started hurting, I wasn't fighting it. I was just in it. Not fighting it, just in it. That distinction, Ray said, is the whole thing. When you fight discomfort, you are divided. Part of your energy and attention goes to the task in front of you. The other part goes to fighting the experience of doing the task. You are working against yourself at the exact moment when you need everything moving in the same direction. He looked at me as we reached the top of the hill. When you stop fighting it, when you accept that the discomfort is part of the task and not a separate problem to be solved, something shifts in a way that is genuinely difficult to describe to someone who hasn't experienced it. You become whole. Everything goes in the same direction. I thought about the field exercise. I thought about the months before it, the constant effort to keep the sealed container sealed, the energy that had gone into performing okayness, into keeping the surface undisturbed while the pressure below it rose past every level I had ever encountered. I had been divided for months. I had been working against myself every single day while believing I was working effectively. How do you actually do it? I asked. How do you change the relationship? How do you walk towards something when every part of your biology is telling you to walk away? He thought about this with the kind of deliberateness he brought to most things. You start small, he said. You don't begin by walking toward the largest source of pain in your life. You begin with smaller discomforts, chosen deliberately every single day. The cold shower instead of the warm one, the harder route instead of the easier one, the difficult conversation instead of the postponed one. You sit with a hard emotion for 5 minutes before you reach for the thing that distracts you from it. He paused. You are training your nervous system the same way you train muscle, with progressive load. You give it increasingly challenging encounters with discomfort and you let it adapt. Over time, the tolerance expands, not just for the small things, for everything, because what is expanding is not your tolerance for any specific type of discomfort. It is your fundamental relationship with the experience of difficulty itself. He described this not as an achievement to be reached, but as a practice to be sustained, something you return to every single day, not because you have mastered it, but because mastery is not the point. The point is the returning. The point is the daily choice, made again and again across weeks and months and years, to go toward the hard thing rather than away from it. He returned to this idea from multiple directions across the weeks that followed, because he understood something about how knowledge settles into a person. It doesn't settle in a single conversation, no matter how precise or well delivered. It settles through repetition and application and the gradual accumulation of experiences that confirm it. Every morning on that trail was another layer. Every morning he found a new angle on the same essential truth. One morning, about 5 weeks in, he talked about the difference between what he called productive suffering and destructive suffering, a distinction he said most people never learned to make because they had spent their lives trying to eliminate suffering entirely rather than learning to work with it intelligently. Productive suffering, he said, was suffering with a direction. It was the discomfort of the difficult run, the cold water, the hard conversation, the grief fully felt. It had a cost and it had a yield. It spent something in you and it gave something back. Strength you could not have gotten another way. Clarity you could not have purchased with comfort. Access to a version of yourself that only appears when the easier version has been exhausted. Destructive suffering was suffering with no direction. The suffering of avoidance, of the sealed container, of the running. It spent the same currency and gave nothing back. It cost you energy and produced only the need for more running. You've been suffering destructively for months, he said, without any accusation in it. A tremendous amount of energy has gone into that suffering, and you have nothing to show for it except a parking lot and a set of transfer papers. He looked at me. That exact same energy, pointed in the right direction, could have given you something. Not less pain, actual pain, honestly experienced, but something that grows from it, rather than something that just keeps running on it. I want to stay with this for a moment because I think it is the clearest articulation of something that people misunderstand about what Ray was teaching me. He was not asking me to suffer more. He was asking me to suffer differently. He was asking me to stop spending the energy of suffering on the maintenance of a structure designed to prevent suffering and to redirect that energy toward the suffering itself, to go through it rather than around it, because around it was infinite and through it was finite. About 6 weeks in, he added a component to our mornings that I had not anticipated. After the run, before the bench and the conversation, he began giving me what I can only describe as deliberate discomfort exercises, not physical challenges designed to test fitness. He knew my fitness was adequate. These were specifically designed to train the relationship he had been describing. One morning, he led me off the trail to a stream that ran cold and fast through the edge of the park, fed by runoff from higher ground, and told me to stand in it for 10 minutes. The cold was immediate and complete. Within 90 seconds, my nervous system had formed a very clear opinion about this activity and was communicating it at high volume. By the 3-minute mark, the entire conversation in my head had narrowed to a single, insistent demand for it to stop. He stood on the bank and watched with complete stillness. He didn't encourage me. He didn't coach me through it. He simply watched with the full, unhurried attention that I had come to understand as his version of presence. Not warmth in the conventional sense, but something more solid than warmth. The certainty that he was entirely there. Around the 4-minute mark, something changed. The cold did not become less cold. My body did not stop wanting out. But something in my relationship to those facts shifted in a way that felt, in the moment, almost like a gear engaging. I stopped spending energy on the argument between what I was experiencing and what I wanted to be experiencing. The argument simply stopped, and without the argument consuming its share of everything available, something else became accessible. The remaining 6 minutes passed differently than the first 4, not easily, but differently, with a quality of presence in them that the first 4 minutes, which I had spent fighting, had not had. When I stepped out onto the bank, he handed me a towel and said, "You found it." "Found what?" I said, through the specific sound of someone whose teeth are trying to keep warm. "The place where the argument stops," he said. "Most people never reach it because they get out while they're still fighting. If you leave while you're still in the argument, you never learn the argument was optional." The argument was optional. I want to pause here for just a second, not because the story stops, but because that phrase right there is the kind of thing that takes time to settle. The argument was optional. If that hit you, if you've been in your own version of that stream fighting something you didn't have to fight, drop it in the comments. Tell me where you are in the story. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. There are more stories on this channel, different voices, different battles, same truth. You're going to want to be here for them. He came back to this concept repeatedly in the weeks that followed, approaching it from different angles, illustrating it with examples drawn from 30 years of watching human beings encounter their limits. He told me about a principle that he said he had seen demonstrated more consistently than almost anything else across his years of work. That suffering you run from becomes larger over time, and suffering you turn to face becomes smaller. Not immediately, and not without cost, but consistently. Because when you face something directly, you learn what it actually is. And what it actually is, the actual dimensions of it, the actual texture and weight of it, is almost never as vast as the shadow it casts when you are looking at it from the wrong direction, from inside the running. "Your grief," he said one morning, about 2 months in, "is not as large as the shape it has taken in your life. The shape it has taken is the size of the running, the size of all the space you've had to clear and keep clear to make sure you don't have to touch it. The thing itself, the actual loss, the actual love, the actual missing, is exactly the size it is, not larger. You've been building a structure around it that makes it look larger, and that structure cost you more than the thing inside it." Motivation versus discipline was a conversation that happened around the 6-week mark, on a morning when I had come to the trail feeling genuinely reluctant in a way I hadn't experienced before. Not the hollow emptiness of the early weeks, but a specific vocal resistance that felt almost like a reasonable argument for staying in bed. I told him. He listened. "Tell me what you think motivation is," he said. "Wanting to do something," I said. "That's right," he said. "And wanting is a feeling. Feelings are produced by your chemistry, your sleep, your food, your circumstances, the quality of the previous day, and approximately 100 other variables you do not directly control." He started running. I followed. If the decision of whether to do the necessary thing is contingent on whether you feel like doing the necessary thing, you have made your actions dependent on conditions you cannot reliably produce. He ran for a while without speaking. "Discipline," he said eventually, "is the decision to do the thing regardless of the feeling, not in spite of the feeling." That framing still puts the feeling at the center. Regardless of it, the feeling is simply not the relevant variable. The relevant variable is the decision. He looked forward at the trail. In 10 years of training selection, I never saw a man make it through on the basis of how he felt. Feelings change in that environment faster than weather. The men who made it had internalized the decision before the feeling became relevant. So when the feeling arrived, and it always arrived, everyone felt like stopping at some point, often many points. The decision was already made and the feeling had nowhere to go. I thought about this in the context of grief again. I had been waiting. I realized this clearly for the first time while running behind this man on a trail in the early morning. I had been waiting to feel ready to address it. I had been waiting for a morning when the loss felt manageable enough to look at directly, when the thought of my father wouldn't physically alter my breathing, when I could trust myself not to fall apart if I opened the door. I had been making my readiness contingent on a feeling, and the feeling couldn't arrive until after the door opened. The door couldn't open until I stopped making it contingent on a feeling. "You don't wait to feel ready," he said that morning, as if he had been following the same line of thought independently and arrived at the same conclusion. "You act, and readiness follows." It has never been the other way around for anything that actually mattered. The last major lesson of our 4 months together arrived in the specific form it needed to arrive in, which is to say, it arrived when I was least prepared to receive it gracefully. About 3 months in, I received news that a memorial gathering was being organized for my father back home, a celebration of life, as the family called it, the kind of event that had been postponed in the immediate aftermath because there had been too much logistics and too many raw edges. Family members wanted me to speak, to say something that did justice to him. The news arrived on a Tuesday evening, and I carried it to Wednesday morning like a stone I couldn't set down. I told Ray at the trailhead before we started. He didn't respond immediately. We ran the full trail without talking, the whole circuit, the hill, the hard stretch at the end. And when we sat at the bench, he spoke. "Your father raised a soldier," he said. "He raised someone who keeps falling apart," I said. "No." The firmness in it was different from anything I had heard from him before. Not harsh, final. "He raised someone who came back. Every time she broke, she came back. That is not falling apart. That is the definition of resilience, precisely stated." He looked at me directly. Resilience is not the absence of breaking. People who have never encountered the specific thing that breaks them have not demonstrated resilience. They've demonstrated luck. Resilience is the pattern of returning. You can break and return, break and return, break and return. And each time you return, the ground under your feet is more solid than it was before, because you have learned, in your actual body, not theoretically, that breaking is survivable. He paused. "Your father didn't raise a woman who would never break. He raised a woman who would never not come back. Those are not the same thing. They are not even close to the same thing. And the sooner you stop spending energy on preventing the breaking, the more energy you will have for the returning." I cried at the bench that morning, in front of Raymond Holt, who I had spent 3 months trying to appear composed in front of. Not because I had decided to, because the container that had been sealed since October had finally opened far enough that what was inside it simply came out. He let it happen. He did not try to manage it or minimize it, or redirect it towards something more comfortable. He sat entirely present in the way he always was, and he let the thing happen that had been waiting to happen for a very long time. When it settled, he said, What you just did, that is the bravest thing I have seen you do since the day we met on that road." The service for my father was 3 weeks later. I flew home to a small city in Kentucky, where people who had known him for decades filled a room that was not large enough for all of them. I stood at the front of that room, and I spoke for 11 minutes about a man who wore brown work boots every day of his life, and carried other people's mail, and raised a daughter alone and never once suggested to her that any of it was more than he was glad to do. I told them that the last thing he taught me was the thing he taught me by dying. That pain is not the enemy, that the running from it is. I did not break during the speech, not because I was suppressing anything, because I had already broken, already returned, already learned in my actual body that the two could exist simultaneously inside the same person, the grief and the standing. The morning after I came back from the service, I drove to the trailhead. 5 a.m. Ray was already there, as he always was, in the same dark jacket, in the same quality of unhurried stillness at the edge of the tree line. We ran the full trail. We didn't speak about the service. We didn't need to. Afterward, on the bench, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a small piece of paper, folded once. He held it out to me. I unfolded it. 2 lines in handwriting that was precise and economical. "Pain is the door. Discomfort is the key." And below it, "You already knew how to use it. I just showed you the door was there." I looked up at him. "I'm done," he said quietly. "Done with what?" "Showing you," he said. "You don't need me to show you anymore." I sat with that for a moment. "Who are you?" I asked. It was not the first time I had asked. but it was the first time I had asked it with the understanding that I was ready for whatever the answer was. He looked at the tree line for a long while. "Someone who spent 30 years learning to recognize the door," he said, "and to recognize the people who had the key already." He turned to look at me. "I knew the first night, in the diner, the coffee was terrible, and you had been crying, and you had transfer orders on your seat, and you still stopped for an old man on the side of the road." He paused. "Character is what you do when you have nothing left. You had nothing left, and you stopped." That told me everything I needed to know. I learned the full scope of who Raymond Holt had been much later, through someone who had served with him, who told me the story in the particular quiet voice that people use when they are describing someone they genuinely revered. The classified operations, the silver star that had been awarded for actions in a mission that has no public record. The decade at the training command, the specific gift for identifying in candidates the one thing that could not be trained into a person. The young man from the small town who had become one of the most decorated operators of his generation, and who, when asked what had made the difference, named Raymond Holt without hesitation. I thought about the diner, the napkin, the trail at 5 a.m, the stream, the bench. I thought about how none of it had felt like training while it was happening, and how all of it had been exactly that. There is something that the best teachers do that most of us spend years trying to understand, and many of us never fully articulate. They do not pour knowledge into empty vessels. They find the door that is already in the person in front of them, the door to the version of that person that already has what they need, and they show them where it is. The knowledge was never in Raymond Holt. It was not something he transferred to me. It was something I already had, locked on the other side of discomfort I had been refusing to enter, and he showed me the door. And then he showed me that I had always had the key. My father knew this. I believe he knew it in the way that people who have lived close to the ground and chosen well come to know things, not through study, but through the accumulated evidence of a life. He had been walking toward hard things his entire life. He had walked toward the shift no one else wanted. He had walked toward the conversations that needed to happen. He had walked toward the grief of raising a daughter alone and found, on the other side of it, the thing that became the central fact of his existence. He wore out those brown boots not because he had to, because showing up was the practice, and the practice was the life. He raised a daughter who stopped for old men on the side of the road when she had nothing left. He raised a daughter who eventually learned to stop running. I am 34 years old. I am a captain. Every morning before my unit begins its day, I run a trail not unlike the one Ray used to take me down. Uneven, hilly, the kind of hard that is genuinely hard and not just uncomfortable. I run it not because it always feels good to run it. Some mornings, it doesn't. I run it because the choice, made again on a morning when I don't want to make it, is itself the practice. The discipline is not in the running. The discipline is in the choosing. I have soldiers in my care who are sitting in their own versions of that parking lot, young and capable and trained and drowning in something that work cannot fix and performance cannot outrun. I tell them what Raymond Holt told me, not always in his words, always with his truth. Pain is not the enemy. The enemy is the negotiation, the limit setting, the careful management of exactly how much discomfort you are willing to tolerate before you decide you have done enough. The enemy is the sealed container and the wall around the sealed container and all the energy you spend every day making sure the door stays closed. The door is always there. It is made of exactly the material of whatever you are most afraid to face. And the only key that opens it is the willingness to turn around, stop running, and look at it directly. I don't know where Raymond Holt is today. We lost touch in the way that lives sometimes lose touch, across distance and years and the movement of careers in directions that weren't planned. But what he gave me is not in any notebook or any archive. It is structural. It is the way I move through hard things. It is the thing I'm trying to give to the soldiers in my care. Every morning, 5 o'clock, I don't wait to feel ready. I act and readiness follows. If you are listening to this and you recognize the parking lot, the one where you are sitting with something you cannot figure out how to carry, with papers that feel like a verdict and an emptiness that work cannot fill, I want to tell you one thing, not that it gets easy, because it does not always get easy. Not that the pain goes away, because it does not always go away. I want to tell you that the distance between where you are and where you are capable of being is exactly the size of the door in front of you. Turn around. Face it. Stop negotiating with it. Stop setting your terms for how much of it you will accept. Stop spending the energy that belongs to the other side of it on keeping the door closed. Walk through. You already know how. You already have what you need. You just need someone to show you the door is there. Maybe that's what this is. If this story found you at the right moment, if you needed to hear that the running is the problem and not the pain, then please share it. Put it in front of someone who's sitting in their own parking lot right now. That's how these stories travel. That's how they reach the people who need them. Subscribe to this channel, leave a comment below. Tell us which part stayed with you, or tell us about your own door. We read every single one. And if you came this far, thank you. These stories exist because you show up to hear them.